Okay, right, thanks everyone. I'm sorry we're in such a small room, I don't know how that happened. But welcome to this Migration Research Group seminar. We are so delighted to have Daria Krivonos as an International Visiting Fellow with us for 6 weeks. She's here now for another 3 weeks, so if you wanted to meet with her, have a coffee with her, talk to her about her work, I'm sure she'd be very...
Yes, please.
That's what she's here to do, so don't hold back. So today, Daria is going to speak about some work that she's doing on a book while she's here. And the title of the talk is Migration, Race and Whiteness, What Can We Learn from Studying Post-Soviet Migration? Just to remind you, Daria works at the University of Helsinki. She's a postdoctoral researcher, and her work crosses themes of race, class, and gender, and how they're revised and remade in the context of East-West migration. We are extremely lucky that we also have a second world expert in race and Eastern Europe here, Bolaji Balogan, who works in the Department of Geography, who is a LiveU fellow there. And I think you have a prize-winning book, in fact, on race and Eastern Europe. So Bolaji is going to give a kind of discussion, a few comments on Daria's presentation. So Daria will present, then we'll hear from Bolaji, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. The presentations are going to be recorded, so we can put those in YouTube if you give your consent. But the discussion, we'll have that completely private. Okay.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Lucy. I would also like to thank Lucy Potter for organizing all the practicalities regarding the seminar, and thank you, Lucy, again for hosting me here. I feel really welcome. I think it's such a great and cozy, nice department. I really enjoy being here. And thanks, of course, Bolaji, for taking the time to engage with my work. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So in my talk, I would like to share some ideas some ideas that I'm developing in my book, working on with a tentative title, Claiming Whiteness, Race and Labor Among Russian Migrants in Helsinki. And I would like to start with a discussion of the current developments on the Finnish-Russian border. And I would like to locate these growing developments in a broader historical context of the production of civilizational hierarchies, histories of race and colonialism in the Northern countries and Eastern Europe. So just to say that I conducted research, ethnographic research among Russian migrants living in Helsinki in 2014-2017. And I believe that the interview accounts of these people can tell us a lot about the workings of race in Europe. And I think it might come as a kind of surprising twist, because usually Finland and Russia and Eastern Europe and Nordic countries are imagined as having no relation to the histories of race and colonialism. But in this talk, I'm going to show a very different picture. So I will start with part one. My talk is divided into 3 parts. So part one, the borders of modernity. On the 9th of November 18th, 2023, the Finnish authorities closed 4 checkpoints on the border with Russia. According to the Finnish authorities, Russia is trying to put pressure on Finland by helping migrants reach the border. Finnish media and authorities have framed the situation as Russia's hybrid warfare. Later, in 2023, all the 8 checkpoints at the border with Russia were closed, and all of them currently remain closed indefinitely. And just to remind you that Russia and Finland are sharing actually the longest single border of the EU, over 1,000 kilometers. I checked this, 800 miles. So now the border is closed, meaning that the checkpoints are closed. even though, as you can imagine, that nobody can really close such a long border which goes like from the Arctic to the deep forests between the two countries. And actually, just to say that some of my colleagues who were writing and arguing against the closure of the border actually received death threats. So it's really kind of a big deal and a big discussion in Finland at the moment. And another development framed as the counter-attack against hybrid warfare is that the government of Finland is currently proposing a law restricting asylum seekers from applying for refuge at the border, on the Finnish borders. And if accepted, the law will allow sending people back without processing their asylum claims. And actually, like now, I know that the Rwanda plan is being implemented in the UK. And then in Finland, the authorities and now the government, it's a right-wing government, actually is taking a lot of inspiration from Britain, and also arguing that we should embrace and implement the Rwanda plan on the level of the EU, and by the fact that now Finland is closing its border and normalizing the fact that
You can continue because there is nobody seeing you from
like normalizing the fact that the border must be closed. I think that we are walking and working towards similar directions. And in the spring, just now, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen visited the border. And that's what she said. We all know how Russian President Vladimir Putin and his allies instrumentalize migrants to test our defenses and try to destabilize us. Now Putin is focusing on Finland, and this is no doubt in response to your firm support of Ukraine and your accession to NATO. So also Finland joined NATO last year, and Sweden joined NATO just this year. And then she continued, this is not just about the security of Finland, but it's about the security of the European Union. We are in this together. We should be more Finnish when it comes to security. So in case you didn't know what meaning Finnish is, it's about protecting the security of the European Union. And here we can see the Prime Minister Orpo and Ursula von der Leyen flying on the helicopter over the forest across the Finnish-Russian border, where actually nothing is happening. That's also another thing. Nothing is happening on that border. So in November 2023, when the border was still open, 958 people applied for asylum. But it was still presented as a hybrid attack. And unless Finland protects itself and closes the border, the numbers will get bigger. And it's actually quite funny that, surprisingly, like the border guards, they are kind of on our side in the sense that they're saying that things are kind of totally under control at the border. We don't see like these masses of people trying to invade Finland, and it's also kind of this interesting moment when I think the border guards who actually do this everyday border work, but they don't kind of buy into this argument. And of course, we can also see in some parallels how the current developments in Finland also replicate the situation at the Belarusian border with Poland, although on a much smaller scale. But it's also very important to remember that it was like the previous government actually run by Social Democrats, and I don't know if Sanna Marin was like widely publicized as this kind of feminist prime minister of Finland, kind of a superstar of Finnish and European politics. Actually, it was under her government that Finland started building the border fence with Russia, kind of foreseeing the situation and trying to protect Finland and the European Union. Even though, again, actually nothing was happening at the border, and still, I think that this picture is very representative, that they're kind of flying over the forest while nothing is happening. But I think that what is interesting here is that of course, there's a lot of literature on migration diplomacy and, of course, like refugees who are used and to pressure different governments. I think that what is interesting here is that kind of how anti-refugee racism and specifically anti-Muslim racism meets the long-term fear of Russia. And it's kind of living in Finland. I also feel like it becomes extremely difficult to talk about this thing, about even talking, like criticizing the whole notion of hybrid attack and hybrid threat, even to talk about the need to open the border open, because immediately you become labeled as pro-Russian or pro-Putin. Like, are you really supporting Putin's politics? So it's a really interesting convergence we are observing here. And I think the kind of the range or the avenues for kind of critical space to discuss these topics, because Russia is imagined as this the ultimate other of Europe, ultimate other of the West. And whenever you kind of question this, okay, what is happening, you, especially me as a Russian national, you very easily become labeled as somebody who's just like supporting Russian politics or being pro-Russia or being against Ukraine. So I think that this border fence, and actually there was very little discussion around building the border fence. And again, I think that everywhere we hear there is no money for anything, there's like austerity politics, but there is of course always the money to build the border fence and invest in this further securitization of the borders. So, and I think that the border fence and the proposed laws then imagine as both as a technology of governing migration, but also becomes this kind of symbolic, as a symbol of this post-Cold War geopolitical formations. So I think that also what we are observing now is this acceleration of civilizational narratives of the West versus the East. And I think that what also I noticed literally is this kind of return of Huntington, also in a kind of more, even somewhat critical political discussions. Yeah, is everything?
Oh, just because online, for the online audience, the slides aren't changing.
Yeah, but we have to go and disrupt you.
Do you know what to do?
The slides are on this computer, so I can't change them on this computer.
Okay, but can you make it so the online people can see the slides?
Actually,
I think I will have to stop sharing and resharing again.
Okay,
so
just-
if you feel really bad,
Yeah,
for,
it's
like
okay.
disrupting,
Do you want to sit here and carry on?
Yeah.
And then next one.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I was saying is that I think that there is kind of this acceleration of civilizational narratives of West versus East. And on the one hand, of course, it has always been, or like, of course, we need to historicize this boundaries in the civilizational hierarchies. But in this sense, I think Huntington's work is kind of quite prominent, and I think that it has kind of made a comeback. And once at the, can I come back? At one conference on migration, I actually heard one scholar actually saying or kind of complaining that how come like Huntington was never really taken seriously. And now that we see that what Russia is doing, we can finally see that Huntington was right. So, and it's telling that, of course, that the map that Huntington uses kind of illustrates this really binary thinking, which demarcates the border between Western Christianity, the Iron Curtain, and the Velvet Curtain of culture, as he called it. And this border demarcates Finland and Russia, as you can see. And actually, in Finland's national narratives, also the border has played a major role in kind of imagining the whole formation of the Finnish nation. But for Huntington, and for people who think that kind of he was right, it's not just kind of a border that divides the two nation states. It's a civilizational border. It's the border that divides and demarcates modernity altogether. So modernity is quite central to these imaginaries of the West and the East, the West and the rest. And so on the one hand, we have the people who made it to the West and made it to the modernity, while others are those against whom we must be protected. So what I want to do now is to kind of come closer to the ethnographic data, ethnographic research, which I've been doing in 2014 and 2017 with Russian migrants living in Finland, and what this border means to them, and kind of how they imagine their migration, how they understand their migration to Finland. Because in a way, for them, migration is also about crossing this civilizational border. So this is part 2 of my talk. I always wanted to live in the West. So this is the quote which I heard many, many times from my research participants. And here we can see the picture of Helsinki. So I always wanted to live in the West or in Europe. That was what I heard repeatedly while talking to my research interlocutors. So migration then is seen as an effort to align themselves with Western modernity vis-a-vis stuckedness and belatedness of socialism. And here I also have this picture of Soviet-style apartment blocks, and I have it here because one of my research participants told me that she moved to Finland precisely because she didn't want to live in this apartment blocks. Even though I need to say that Helsinki also has very similar apartment blocks, and I'm sure maybe Sheffield too. But again, I think what matters here is kind of how modernity is being imagined, and kind of how this socialist architecture is seen as the symbol of kind of backwardness and stuckedness, and then migration to Finland becomes a way of kind of disidentifying yourself from this. And also, of course, it's not only about the symbolic imaginaries, but also kind of imaginaries of better economic opportunities and better standards of life. And on the left, I have a bus. And I would also take this bus, and I know also when I did my field work with Ukrainian migrants in Poland, also people would use same buses. So before the COVID-19 pandemic, Helsinki was actually quite full of these buses and minivans waiting for their departure to St. Petersburg. And one could get a ticket right on the spot, and the ticket would be only 30 euros. Actually, it's even cheaper than taking a taxi from Helsinki suburbs to downtown. So with 30 euros, you could actually travel to St. Petersburg. And it would take around 6 hours, or there was even a fast train, which would take people across the border, and it would take 3.5 hours. So actually, it's very close. But I think what I also write about, it's just despite this geographic proximity and easiness to cross the borders, there's this notion of temporal distance. This is why I have this buildings here, which kind of represent or they embody this temporal distance to my research interlocutors. So yeah, despite this kind of easiness of crossing the border, what matters to people is that they can cross this kind of symbolic border of modernity. So Finland was something more than a mere geographic location and a nation state. Finland is the embodiment of the West. And of course, like from the literature on coloniality, we know that the axis of time and space are actually absolutely fundamental for the understanding of modernity, seen as a distinctly different space-time. Modernity is narrated as a temporal rupture from the previous non-modern time. And this is exactly what my research participants were trying to do. And they were trying to kind of kind of fashion themselves as proper Europeans by migrating to Finland. So what I then want to do in my work is actually question and unmake and historicize this category of the West and category of Europe. So what does it mean to think of Europe and the West on the margins of the European Union? And of course, we also know that whenever we talk about Europe and we talk about the West, it inevitably brings us to the questions of race. And this is where my contribution is, or where I'm trying to kind of position and locate myself, is the contribution on the intersections of migration and race in the Nordic context and the context of Eastern Europe. Yes, and also we can remember Fanon, like that how Europe is literally the creation of the third world. But then the question is, what does it mean in the context of Finland? And what does it mean for Russian migrants when they want to become European and when they try to kind of cross this border of modernity? And then kind of my argument, one of my arguments is that they become entangled with this relational understandings of racism and racialization in Europe, when they become both racialized as not fully white migrants and not fully white Europeans, and they actively racialize and claim whiteness vis-a-vis other non-white people. So a kind of my bigger argument is that kind of despite seeing themselves kind of as outsiders of modernity, which is also kind of very problematic if we take into account Russia's own imperial and colonial histories, how they become and they stay loyal to the project of European whiteness through migration to the West. Yes, and this brings me to the third part of my talk on race, colonialism, and whiteness in Finland and Russia. Here, as a background, I have a building of a Race Biology Institute in Uppsala, Sweden. Actually, I was in Uppsala 1 month ago, just before coming here. And because I read about this building and the research that was done there, like a lot of research on eugenics was conducted in that building. So I went straight away to check that building, and it is there. And there is no like any markings or nothing, no mentioning of the history of this building. And it's there, like fully integrated in the university's infrastructure. So people continue working in this building. And actually, after this Race Biology Institute was dismantled, I think in the 1950s, it just like continued functioning as some other institute in the University of Uppsala. Yes, and what I'm also trying to do in this part of my talk is also kind of question this liberal understanding of racism. I think we also discussed it with Bolaji, that there is kind of this common understanding of racism as a matter of individual prejudice or lack of education. So if we only educate people to become tolerant and loving the difference and kind of embracing multiculturalism and diversity, there'll be no racism anymore. But then what I want to show here is kind of how race has been absolutely fundamental for the formation of certain nation states and the nation state of Finland, even though you wouldn't think that this is the case. So I engage with this with two geographies. So in this sense, I'm kind of attacked, can be attacked from both sides. Race in the Nordic countries and race in Central and Eastern Europe. And both of these geographies are typically considered as having no relation to race and colonialism, even though I also need to say that in the recent years, like a lot of work has been done on the topic. And I also see from my teaching how students become more and more aware, and they already come like very knowledgeable, and they want to learn more. And so they really question the canon of sociology and what is the nation state, what are the Nordic countries, and involvement of the Nordic countries in colonial projects. So Just to say that I'm part of a bigger stream of thought, and kind of it's kind of collective work that we are doing. But the general narrative, it's kind of about like happy Nordic countries. Like Finland has been claimed as this for the 7th time in a row as the happiest country in the world. And also whenever I travel, kind of Scandinavia is always presented as this wonderful, happy place, even though I think that in the recent years with the kind of far-right governments and movements, I think that this image is going a bit like it's fading. But again, we must historicize that kind of, okay, of the social democracy. For whom has it been when there was even social democracy? Yes. So there are these public narratives of white innocence, to use Gloria Wecker's term, and the general narrative is about the exemplary achievements in equality, in gender equality. But of course, gender equality is always has been understood as the equality between white national men and white national women. And also racial exceptionalism, that these places have never been racial. That race is just not applicable here, even though Finland, Finnish people can't imagine the nation as a white nation. And this is kind of also makes us question that race is never really about the color, it's also about whiteness itself. And another narrative in Finland is that it has been under the rule of other empires and kingdoms, that it was first under the Swedish rule for 6 centuries. Then it became the autonomous Grand Duchy of the Russian Empire, and it gained independence in 1917. So it's the narrative of a young, innocent nation, which only recently kind of became independent, and it's very equal and never been involved in colonial endeavors. And at the same time, we also, when we talk about Central and Eastern Europe, we have also kind of a similar narrative, now I realize it, that these countries haven't been involved in Western colonial projects. And I think that what also plays a role here is that the role of the Soviet Union, kind of the typical depiction of the Soviet Union as the affirmative action empire. Actually, that's this empire that has kind of counteracted the West and has been against Western imperialism. And Du Bois traveled to the Soviet Union and praised it, saying that, okay, this is the country that refuses to be white. And yeah, kind of, there was also a very idealized image of the Soviet Union among some Black intellectuals. And today the narrative is that also like Central and Eastern European countries are victims of the West and the victims of Russia. And Russia says, or like the state narrative of Russia says that Russia is also a victim of the West. And that's why kind of Russia is now attacking Ukraine, because it's kind of protecting itself from the West. So that's a very twisted logic, but it's also interesting that Putin is using the language of decolonization, that by attacking Ukraine, it's almost like a move to decolonize Russia from the West. So talking about how decolonization can be nowadays used however you want, yeah, you can think of the case of Putin and his narratives of Russia. Yeah, even though I also need to say that indigenous groups and minoritized population of Russia has started like talking much more and actually gained much more visibility and space, because actually the language of decolonization has also entered the more mainstream space in Russia after the attack of Ukraine. Yes, so we have this kind of general hegemonic narratives of these two regions as having no relation to race and colonialism, but my kind of the starting point of my work is that modernity and coloniality, to use like Mignolo's, I think still useful formulation, and race doesn't have global dynamics and circulation. And I'm going to show more about that. We should tell more about that. And then, of course, when we talk about Finland and race, one of the immediate things that comes is how did the Finns become white? And there are very particular histories around the struggles for recognizing Finns or making other world recognize that Finns are white. So in the racial, scientific racial like categories, Finns were located as non-Europeans. They were kind of these outliers and designated as belonging to this Mongol race. It comes from this Blumenbach's studies. So Finns were kind of considered as non-Europeans, and actually even when Finnish migrants would arrive in the United States, they would sometimes be refused US citizenship because they were not considered as white, and only white people could get citizenship in the US. So it was really kind of also like the transnational circulation of this knowledge. But then the response was not to question these theories, not to overthrow the whole racist project of knowledge production, but there was massive effort that went into proving that Finns were white. And how they did that is mostly through scientific racism against Sami people, the indigenous Sami people who live in the north of the Nordic countries, the only indigenous people in the EU today. And this Race Biology Institute, which I showed you before, is actually the place where research was conducted on the Sami with all the like measurements of physiognomy. And it's only kind of by disidentifying themselves from Sami, indigenous Sami, and through racism against Sami people that Finns kind of managed to climb the hierarchies of race and to prove their whiteness. So kind of already here we see that kind of this mythology of whiteness in Finland being based on the exclusion and racism and assimilation of Sami population. And there are also histories of sterilization of Sami people. And still today, the land of Sami people continues to be extracted. There are mining companies which take resources from the land of Sami, and the Finnish state still tries to control the Sami parliament and the representation of Sami and who is the real Sami. So kind of the Finnish state is really kind of continuing to control and to suppress the indigenous population. And for a long time, Finland's colonial histories were discussed through the term of complicity. So there is the term like colonial complicity, which tends to kind of alert to the situation that Finland has been neither the part of the colonial center nor it's an outsider to European colonialism. And I'm going to show more examples later. And it's about like also the complicity. It's about the seductiveness of being included in the hegemonic notions of Eurocentric modernity. So even if you're not recognized as the European core, it's still the attraction and the seductiveness of being included in the core. It's not like the rejection or dismantling of this project. But now more and more scholars, indigenous scholars in Finland, are actually talking about that complicity is not a good enough term to talk about Nordic countries and Finland's involvement in colonialism. They say that actually we should talk about Finland's explicit settler colonial project along with other Nordic countries in relation to Sami population. And they also connect the overseas colonialism and the colonial fantasies and colonial effort. For example, in what is today Namibia, also Finland was sent its delegation to today's Namibia with the effort to kind of controlling that space. In the end, they failed to do that, but still, again, this idea of seductiveness and the willingness to participate. So then the scholars then connect this overseas colonialism with the colonization of the northern part of the region. Yes, so we can see that how racism and assimilation in this history are connected to nation building here. Yeah, and just to say a couple of words about the also academic knowledge production. I think kind of how sociologists and anthropologists were quite active participants in this project. How like anthropologists had their expeditions to Sapmi, and how they use this kind of modern scientific methods. And now kind of this idea of being modern and using photography, it's also about kind of constructing yourself as a modern Western nation vis-a-vis the indigenous people. And then, yes, more research on how the Sami were constructed as a threat to the modernizing nation. And again, that's this idea of the nation and the modernity. Who can be part of the modern nation, and how Sami were seen as this kind of people against whom that this boundary of modernizing nation was constructed. And then, yeah, people were exposed in the zoos, also in Central Europe. Yeah, I also invite you to watch some movies, like for example, Sami Blood. And there are many more work, also artistic work being done in this field. And then some more example of kind of the Finnish scientists' effort to prove that they belong to this relatively pure East Baltic type. They said, okay, if it's not the Nordic type, then at least it's this pure East Baltic type, this particular type which lives in the Baltic region. Yes, and these pictures appeared in 1932, and then they actually were reprinted in the book published in 1985. Yeah, and it's interesting, like the title of the book is Mongols or Germans, the Finns in the racial theories. Yes, and then there were just like a brief example, also how I think in the 1950s, the Finnish woman won this Miss Universe contest. And then how also for Finland it was seen as a chance to construct itself as a white nation by kind of exposing this woman, this like white Finnish woman across the world, and her being photographed like vis-a-vis some kind of exotic sceneries. How for Finland, it's still like in the 1950s, it was a chance to prove that Finland belongs to the West, to Europe, and that Finns are white. Then talking about settler colonial projects. So yeah, Finland was part of Sweden at the time, but actually Finnish merchants and Finnish individuals, actually with power, were quite at the center and like played a very prominent role in this settler colonial projects. For example, in the Americas, and then. We see like even some locations were renamed, and one of them is called Finland. It's the area near today's Philadelphia. And it's actually still today you can find like some buildings which were built by Finnish settlers. And then, so St. Barth was, so Sweden had colonies in the Caribbean, and St. Barth was one of them. And again, like there is like a discussion, can we talk about Finnish colonialism when Finland was part of Sweden? But then some researchers show that, for example, attracted by the authorities' promises of a good life and favorable economic prospects in the Caribbean, Finns who suffered from failed crops gathered in crowds in the harbors and waited to be shipped to St. Barth. So again, kind of talking about the seductiveness and the ideas that elsewhere you can get better opportunities, even though you can say that, okay, Finns were part of of Sweden, and okay, these were poor people whose crops failed, and they were poor peasants. But yet, the colonial project was very seductive and attractive for these people at the expense of other people's lives in St. Barths. And apparently, so this is the coat of arms of St. Barths, today's coat of arms. And apparently, like these three crowns are coming from the Swedish coat of arms. So there are kind of clear similarities. And then also ships with sugar and rum sailed to Turku, which is a city in the southwest of Finland. And they sailed from Gustavia, the capital of St. Barth, in the 18th century. So, and these are just like some examples. I think there are many more examples of also Finland's missionary actions in the African continent, there is Namibia. But then also the idea of Russianness in Finland. So as I said, Finland was part of the Russian Empire until 1917. And when Finland gained its independence, a civil war broke out, and then Russians became associated with Bolshevism and communism as a threat from the East. And a threat to Finland's independence. But what is important here, like coming back to the civilizational hierarchies and these ideas of West and what is the meaning of the West, that Finnishness was constructed in opposition to Russianness in the process of building Finland into an independent Western nation. So it's not just an independent nation, but what is key to this idea is that Finland is an independent Western nation. So, and Thomas Zaritsky uses this term, ideologies of Eastness, actually in relation to Poland, and kind of how Poland racializes and constructs the East as the other, like today's Belarus and Ukraine. But I think maybe it's useful actually to borrow this term, ideologies of Eastness, to think about Finland and how Russianness can be racialized as the other. And then also after Finland gained its independence, like some prominent individuals, like professors and political actors, that they would argue that Finland has a missionary task of world importance. It should act as the guardian of the Western culture and against the barbarous East. And kind of coming back to the beginning of my presentation, you can see that kind of, in a way, Finland continues to play its role, or like the authorities kind of continue to see the mission of Finland as guarding the Western civilization from the barbarous East. Yes, actually I've been talking for so long, and there is still a lot to say. Yes, but then like talking about Russian migrants which are interviewed and their claims to whiteness after they migrate, I think it's very important to mention here that I did interviews with Russian migrants who belong to white majority population in Russia. So if I interviewed non-white Russians, that would be like a very different picture, because Russia itself is an empire still today. And Madina Tlostanova's work, the colonial feminist scholar, has been really important, has been really prominent and inspiring for many scholars. And then she argues how Russian Empire and the Soviet Union strove to emulate Western European imperialist discourses as a way to compensate for its own inferiority as the secondary empire of modernity. And then she has this great quote, which I think is also can be used to describe my research participants who come from white backgrounds, that ethnic Russian practices white supremacy in front of non-Europeans, also in relation to its own non-European population in Russia, and resents being rejected by the Western society, which does not see him as part of its racial sameness. And that's why I think that now I'm trying to be like more careful by arguing that, okay, East European migrants, and specifically Russian migrants, are racialized in Finland. But I think it's also important to remember that these are the people who actually lose their white privilege. after migration. And Russia has also a huge history of eugenics and scientific racism, and there were anthropological expeditions to Central Asia, to the Caucasus, Siberia, Volga region, and they clearly had a very explicit racial kind of coloring. And as Marina Mogilner argues that producing knowledge and racial knowledge and also kind of introducing the whole discipline of anthropology to the Russian Empire was also part of becoming a more modern Western empire. Yes, so if we can take some notes, just like some summary, is that, and I'm borrowing it from Bolaji here, how kind of this discourse of peripherality, that some places are just peripheral, it actually can oversimplify racism, global dynamics and circulation. And in relation to Russia, that participation in the international race discourse made Russia a European country and a European empire. Actually similar to Finland, as we can see that production of this racial knowledge was part of the kind of constituting itself as a modern Western nation. Yes, and so Russian migrants was also is important because quite often there is this argument that migrants from Eastern Europe are racist because they never encountered race before. But it's also very problematic because it imagines the east of Europe as this kind of white homogeneous space. That kind of there is no race. Like race is not applicable to this geography, but I argue that racialization becomes visible to them because they lose their white privilege. Yes, and then I just have some examples here, how my research participants navigated these structures and how they navigate their own racialization. So just to say, by the way, that the Russian migrants, they constitute 40% of all migrants in Finland. So it's a really like a visible and large part of non-citizen population in Finland. And usually people get jobs in the so-called low-skilled sector. So they really struggle to valorize their cultural capitals. So I was kind of once helping this person, which I call Alisa here, to print her CV and to prepare her like job applications. And I click print, and then it's the first time I also saw her surname. And then I said like, oh, it's a really beautiful surname. And then she says, of course it's beautiful. This is because I have chosen it myself. Then she explained that when she got her Finnish citizenship, she also changed her surname. I just Googled beautiful Swedish surnames, talking about the kind of hierarchies also in the Nordic countries. Google beautiful Swedish surnames and pick the one I like the most from the list. My name is also quite international, especially if I change a couple of letters and its spelling, which I also did. And then she said that employers started calling her and inviting her for job interviews more often. So here we can see kind of how the surnames are actually becoming a form of capital and literally bringing economic capital to people. And actually, I also read that many surnames in Finland and in Sweden are protected, so you can't just pick. Of course, like in a way, it makes sense. I understand, but if you think about it from the perspective of capital, kind of how surname becomes a form of capital which is being protected, so you can't just take any Swedish surname. So, kind of how people try to pass as white Finns. But at the same time, it's also, being this, Alex Levitsky uses this term, ambivalent racialization, kind of, while being ambivalently racialized, they still have a chance to pass while others don't pass. And I think that passing is not unproblematic because, again, while individually you can be invited for more job interviews, on a structural level, you're still kind of reproducing the system of whiteness. Yes, and here I have actually the picture from lovely Finnish springtime with ice and two presidential candidates. So both actually one is more far right, and the other one, I don't know, center right. Actually, now the president of Finland, and actually kind of supporting the closure of the border. But then in 2017, I talked to Andrei also, which is a pseudonym, and Andrei is unemployed, and actually you can be unemployed in Finland and even receive unemployment benefits if you stay with a particular visa, which means that either you have a partner who kind of maintains you or sponsors you, or you worked enough years that now you're kind of entitled for unemployment benefits. But what he's saying is that while being unemployed and really struggling with finding work, he says, I think Finland should change its migration policy. They should take fewer asylum seekers and take more rich people who can sustain themselves in Finland. They come here to get all the welfare benefits. Okay, we can take the asylum seekers, but the welfare benefits should be only for Finns. So you can see like how he's speaking, he's like trying to navigate and to come up with his like ideology and understanding of migration. And you see kind of how the welfare plays a very strong role here. It becomes as a form of bordering. Yeah, I also get benefits, he says, but I just can't find work. I have no way out from my situation. That's why I'm unemployed. While there are others, asylum seekers, lazy ones, who just take a plane to come here to get the benefits. They're simply not able to work. We should go to other countries because we suffer from that. We live here and we suffer because of them. So we can see kind of how from first kind of realizing that he's the one who's actually being unemployed, he's gradually kind of inscribing himself in the Finnish majority who are entitled and who are deserving of welfare benefits. But I think it also has to do with the attempt to claim respectability, which comes hand in hand with claiming whiteness. And also all these metaphors of lazy asylum seekers, also like which has colonial histories, kind of how the uncivilized others must be civilized and how they must be taught to labor, and to kind of how capitalism must be brought as a gift to these populations. So kind of then how Andrei is claiming his whiteness, which is then tied very closely to the deservingness of welfare benefits, even though he's not able to participate in waged labor. So that's my last slide, and it's more about like some points for discussion. And I just wanted to say that kind of, I think that all my presentation in the talk was about how they supposedly like peripheral locations remain loyal to whiteness, even though they are not included in the core of European colonialism, but also how the avenues of dealing with alienation in terms of kind of how Russian migrants are not able to get access to certain jobs, how they have to change their surnames to pass and to be regarded as equal. So how the avenues of dealing with this alienation contribute to the reinforcement of racist structures. So their way of claiming whiteness and respectability comes at the cost of other people. Yes, and I think that's kind of the large argument that I'm trying to make in my work, is that there are these those migrants and populations which are often excluded from the discussion of race, but actually they play a very important role in the policing of the boundaries of European whiteness. Yes, thank you.